Welcome back, everybody, to another episode on season 2 of Beyond the Borderline. Today, we're going to talk about censorship. Take it away, Cam.
Well, here we are again for another season. As Connor said, we'll be discussing free speech and censorship, which is, an extremely relevant issue today, as you might say that, their free speech is at least a little bit maybe under threat in recent years. So I think we'll discuss the value of free speech as it relates to, living in a democracy, a functioning democracy, and kind of the blurred lines between free speech and hate speech, and kind of when censorship is okay, if it ever is at all. So yeah, I mean, free speech, what more do you need to say? It's the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the first of the enumerated rights in the American Bill of Rights. Even in Canada, it's the first of our charter rights under the name freedom of expression. It's been adopted by various, burgeoning democracies around the world. So it's clear that freedom of speech is, intrinsically tied to democratic and liberal ideas of governance and of organizing a society. So the question is then, what happens when that's under threat? What does that mean for our country, for our generation, that maybe free speech isn't necessarily held to be as sacred as it may have been in the past? Even that's a controversial statement, though. Some people would say, well, that's an exaggeration. There is no threat to free speech, yada, yada. So what do you
talking about cancel? Are you talking about cancel culture when you talk about a threat to free speech?
That's certainly a part of it. Yeah, just the general shutdown of debate, right? The general polarization of our society into, sides that can't have a rational discussion with one another.
It's the death of liberal ideals, the true liberal ideals. The traditional term of liberalism, which has been bastardized today, right? So when I'm saying all of those rights that you hold dear to yourself, freedom of expression, freedom of association, all those rights in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that Canadians take for granted, those are based on traditional liberal ideals. And if society is heading towards the erosion of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, then that is the death of traditional liberalism, which I would argue is, we're heading towards that. If we're heading towards that trajectory, that's something that we should be greatly concerned with, because all of those civic rights that you hold dear to yourself are upheld by those traditional liberal values. And if you suddenly disregard those ideals, then we're heading towards patterns that we've seen in history, where you can no longer have a dissenting opinion, and dissenting opinions are important for the exchange of ideas.
Yeah, well, exactly. So maybe it needs to be, I don't think it needs to be said, but maybe it does, that free speech is critical to a democracy. Why? One, well, it allows citizens to publicly dissent with the government, for one thing, which that's another thing, right? Like, and I think we mentioned this before, but people take our democracies today for granted. And it's like, look, throughout most of human history, the average person was not able to voice dissent against their government, right? That's something extremely valuable, because it means that we are indeed committed to the principle that the people actually rule here. And two, we talked about this before when we tried to record this episode before, but we had some issues. But we talked about this before. The most important part about free speech being the battleground of ideas. How does anything, how do we progress ideologically as a society? how do we get smarter, and invent new things and become more civilized? Well, it's ideas hashing it out in the social arena, and each side needs to be free to bring their ideas to the table, to hash it out in a respectful way without, shutting down your opponents because you're offended or whatever it may be. And then from that, the good ideas will rise to the top. That's the theory, right? And in fact, that's the best argument for the complete unrestriction of free speech, right? So you could say, well, maybe there should be certain hate speech laws, and maybe there should, but possibly the best argument against that is you should just allow anyone to say anything, because shitty ideas will be put down almost immediately, right? I don't know. Tell me if that makes sense.
I mean, I feel like there's definitely
that's the
some
problem,
things
right?
that,
If you call someone's idea a shitty idea, you risk, because there are so many small sects and groups of people that identify with some specific issue or some specific culture, and if you are suddenly diminishing that person's idea or that culture's idea or whatever it may be, you risk being canceled by cancel culture. You risk being labeled a misogynist. You risk being labeled a radical. So it seems that more and more we're heading towards, a playing field of labeling people with harmful labels to prevent them from expressing their opinion. And I argue that's diminishing the opportunities for new schools of thought and for innovation. So we're not actually helping ourselves by doing that. We're in fact hurting ourselves. So yeah, maybe you feel that you're being hurt by what someone's saying, and in the short run, you're thinking, well, if I stop this person from saying these things, I'm not going to be hurt. But in the long run, you're condemning your entire species.
Yeah,
well, I think
Connor,
there's
you were
definitely,
about to say something.
yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's some things that should be monitored and should not be allowed.
Yeah, like blatant prejudice.
Like racism should not be welcome anywhere, I believe, and
yeah,
that's a big one, I think.
but see, the problem is, I think everyone, or almost everyone with a sane mind, believes that, right? But then it gets into, well, like any issue, there's no black and white. So then it gets into the shades of gray. It's like, what becomes racism? Like, for example, the huge protest back in 2020 over the death of George Floyd, which was, obviously an unspeakable incident. You can't really, it was a tragic incident, right? And the police officers were at fault. However, the current social climate doesn't even allow for dissenting opinions of, pushing back against the narrative that, for example, all police are basically evil, especially among our generation.
If you look at the United States and like how long it takes to be a cop in the States, they definitely need to have reform and improve the policing system in the United States.
Yeah, but that's not the issue, though. The issue is like when.
Well, I think that's the base. I think that should be the base of this issue.
Well, the
if
base.
we want to get into a larger discussion on policing, I'm happy to do that. But the focus that Cam is trying to say here is using policing specifically around the issue of George Floyd as an example of, I can't have a dissenting opinion about what happened here, because if I do, I'll be labeled as a racist or I'll be canceled. And
right.
That's not necessarily a good thing. Like, we should be able to talk about these bad things, especially in a critical way, even if it's dissenting towards what the majority is in belief of.
Right. And my point was.
Are you saying that you believe that it's a good thing that he got shot, Ryan?
No, not at all. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Okay, stop. First of all, he didn't get shot. Let's get our facts straight here. If we're gonna comment on this issue,
oh, you're right.
We need to have our facts.
He got beat. He got beat, right?
Well, yeah, he was basically choked out and suffocated. But
yeah.
So again, I was using that issue as just an example. I'm not saying that the police officer's conduct was debatable. The courts have settled that,
Mhm.
right? They were in
It's
the wrong.
about whether you're allowed to argue it.
Whether you're allowed
online
to
and freely.
argue what, no, it's not even about what they did. It's whether or not you're allowed to argue the virtue of the police at all,
Mhm.
right? And if you do, it's at that time especially, you know, you face various forms of harassment or you know, censorship. But that's the other thing that I want to clear up, is that when we're talking about this, there's censorship comes at two levels. One, from the state itself through legislation and social controls. So that is not really happening right now, right? There's no really laws on the book that are infringing our more or less absolute right to free speech. But there's another form of censorship, and that's social and cultural. And that's what's happening right now. It's not necessarily that the state is infringing against the people's rights. It's that one half of the population, and again, this is generalized, wants to shut up the other half of the population. And maybe that other half wants the other side to shut up, you know, but that's the point. It's polarization of the people via political discourse that is just, if you don't agree with what is culturally popular at the moment, you're
Mhm.
done. You're done.
Yep. Well,
And
just to circle back really quick to what you were saying about the virtue of policing, Cam, just to clear that up, because I think I know where you were heading with that, and it's very important. What we and Cam were getting at is, we're not here to debate the conduct of what those police officers did to George Floyd, because there is nothing to debate there. It was horrible. They were wrong. But that being said, whenever a police officer, whether it's the police officers that, you know, killed George Floyd, or if it's another police officer that conducted an unspeakable act, culture and media seems to point towards demonizing all police officers and having you believe that all police officers act that way, when that couldn't be further from the truth. There are a lot of good police officers out there, and because of these horrible acts committed by these other police officers, shouldn't loop them into the same category. And if you do that, that's unjust.
Yeah. And that we could have a whole other episode on that later on, actually, is like the whole like ideology of this kind of groupthink ideology of, you know, it takes the form of identity politics and whatnot, but characterizing a bunch of people, you know, by the actions of one, or thinking of a bunch of individuals as one unified homogenous group, discounting the fact that they're actually individual people with their own interests, not necessarily group interests. But that's another topic of discussion.
I wanted to go into, we touched on like the legislative branch of like how you can be censored, how you can stifle free speech, but I wanted to go into a bit of the social side, these platforms that you can either be in two camps or two realities. One, you side with these large corporations and you agree that they're actually downplaying their scope and how they're responsible for common discourse now. And the second one would be that they have full knowledge of what the users are responsible for on their platform, and they choose to silence those. One is very different. You know, Twitter can say, you know, we're not responsible for what users do on our platform, and therefore we don't actually have any control over what they say. And on the other hand, oh, we actually can single-handedly shadow ban. We can just, at the flick of a switch, just cancel somebody. So I
Yeah.
find it's different now, and it's unfortunate that we're so polarized, and that it seems that the left has such a grasp on all of these social medias, because in a way, like, I think you look at the grid, I think it's the political grid where, you know, creative people are more on the liberal side. That could be just coincidence that they're in positions of power in all these platforms, but it's just very interesting that one side of the aisle basically has all the power and basically can dictate what people can say and kind of stifle discourse that we're seeing now anyway.
Yeah, well,
But,
the thing about the social media companies is they can hide behind the fact that they're corporations, right? That they're
Mhm.
private entities. But there's a debate to be had. Like, it's true that so much of our discourse happens on these platforms that to silence someone for, breaking the terms of conditions or what have you,
community
it, it,
guidelines.
it yeah, community guidelines, it's very similar to the action that a powerful state would take against a citizen, right? Because if you're completely banned off all social media platforms, especially if you purport to be an influential person or a thinker or someone that shares ideas about politics, and as we've seen, social media can influence elections in many ways. Well, I don't know how much longer does that can they hide behind being a private entity when they act in reality like a quasi-governmental thought police, basically,
It's very interesting.
Here's the
'Cause
thing, though. People
these
don't need to use those. People don't need to use those platforms, right? There's other platforms people can look to
right? Well,
get
that's
other
the classic
source. But
argument.
I guess there's that whole thing about like what is it, running into the echo chamber, or whatever, where you're constantly hearing the same ideas over and over and over again, and you're not able to open up to a broader set of ideas to kind of formulate, okay, this is what one group of people is saying, this is what another group, or one person versus one person, and maybe there's something in the middle, that there's a middle ground that makes the most sense. You just listen to this echo chamber of one specific side, and so that's all you're hearing, maybe. But at the end of the day, yeah, you don't have to use these forms of social media. You don't have to
No, you don't, but the
listen
point
to
is
specific
that
person.
it puts certain ideas or people at an immediate disadvantage that has real life consequences. The same way that that if a government censored you, you know what I mean?
they
Like, for
have
example,
the same weight on
yeah, like,
your life.
just for one
If there was really if you really wanted to listen to somebody, or somebody wanted to get their message out, they could do it in other ways.
which ways?
There's
How
no
could you
way
possibly
other than
garner as much attention?
there's no way other than social media that allows you to reach as many people where your message would have the same effect.
Yeah, but you talked about social media as it's one thing, where social media is many different platforms
Yeah,
that
but they
interact,
all
so you can
They
mostly
all
interact
have the
with
same
different.
thing in common in that if you talk about something that they don't want you to talk about, they'll stop you from talking about it.
Yeah, like YouTube itself.
Yeah.
And this is going to be posted on YouTube, so we'll see what happens. But
Yeah, you
It's
might
a
get a
love-hate
strike on our first
relationship.
episode.
YouTube itself is just horrible with that, and it's just strange to me that the one thing, and this has really started to come to the fore more so in the pandemic era, if you want to call it that. I mean, the 2020s so far, is the whole issue of misinformation and disinformation. And so on YouTube, I just watch random videos on YouTube, and it's like a title that's clearly like satirical or like talking about something that from like mythology or something, that's probably fake, but then they flag it and like link to a Wikipedia article being like, this is why it's fake. And it's like, man, we know that already.
It's like,
We
what?
we
Stop
don't,
insulting my intelligence.
right? Or the
The
whole,
whole idea is that, well, I guess if you consider
There's
critical thinking as a value of yours, you should make
there's
up your own mind.
there's younger people than us that are using these things that don't know.
but what it boils down to
It-
is who is the arbiter of truth, you know? Right now, these social media companies and their fact checkers, Reuters and whoever else may be involved, are basically positioning themselves as the truth. The corporate media is trying to do the same thing. We are the truth. If you don't like CNN, or you don't like MSNBC, or you don't agree with, what is coming out of the mouths of the press secretary, then you believe misinformation. You're a purveyor of disinformation if you believe that, for example, maybe we had one too many lockdowns over the past couple of years. Your posts will get flagged on social media. You'll get banned. You may get fired from your job. And so again, that's not coming from the government. It's very sneaky. It's pervasive. It's not coming from the government, strictly speaking, but it's coming from employers. It's coming from these social media giants. It's coming from corporate news outlets. All of these entities which wield an extreme amount of power over the private sector, over our lives, over elections, over the cultural narrative in general. That's the issue at hand, right?
So that begs the question it begs the question that, is this all collective? Are all these corporate organizations, are these government institutions, are they working together? Or is it just a series of people that, or is it just a series of organizations that all have the same views that are acting independently, but they're feeding and gaining off each other? And if that's the case, to what end?
Here's a different perspective. What if they're just trying to, their target audience or their target market, they want to bring more attention. They want to see more people, more clicks, more views, more likes. So like as a corporation, what do? You don't want to lose money. So you appease the people on your platform.
I don't think it's entirely about money.
I think they're
It's about
power. They're
power.
gonna lose more money anyways.
Yeah, if anything, there's certainly, in the last 2 years, there's certainly been a resurgence of more right-wing conservative ideals. And maybe that's not just because more people are becoming conservative or right-wing. Maybe there's just, because of all of this speech stifling, that it's caused a lot more conservatives who were once quiet to come out and speak out against this, right? That could be the result of what's happening.
I think certainly like libertarianism is rising. Libertarianism was challenged severely over the last 2 years over the extreme, in some cases, extreme overreaches of government power and of government collusion with media and with the, medical industry and whatnot. And again, we're not getting into any of these issues surrounding COVID specifically, but, surrounding things that we know are extremely controversial topics. But to even voice any dissent over the past couple of years about the policies that were being put in place, the ethics of those policies, it's like, you're treated as a conspiracy theorist and a purveyor of misinformation, or an imbecile, or both, or somehow a threat to national security and to democracy, even though you're simply voicing your opinion against the government, which claimed for itself an unprecedented amount of power. And so certainly libertarianism and has been awoken, I think, in the West. And a spotlight has been shone now upon free speech and free expression and free association, being able to gather with who you want, being able to speak your mind and not be silenced or ridiculed for it. That's the other thing, is that, again, this is not coming from government, it's coming from people, is the ridicule and the absolute unwillingness to debate, to hear out your opponent. Like, I would love to debate my political opponents on any topic of their choice. It would be fun, for one thing. Maybe I'm, a freak in that regard. I like that, but we should have the respect for our fellow people to hear out what they have to say, unless it's completely absurd, obviously, the moon is a hologram, all that kind of bullshit. Like, but
The
again,
Earth is
that's
flat.
where the individual can decide. I'm not a dumbass, so I don't believe that the moon is a projection. And collectively, we can all say the same thing. You know, I'm not a dumbass. Let's let these ideas fight each other, and the best one will win. If you believe that human beings are inherently rational beings, you know, maybe
I
you don't.
find it so concerning that, because we've seen all throughout history, the government turning on its own people, you see dictators, authoritarians. I just find it so baffling that in a civil society, or maybe pseudo civil now, we're seeing, especially in the West, that people are turning on regular people. It's just very scary that if you have one point of view, if you even hint at one point of view, you're ostracized from your group. You're just, as Cam mentioned earlier, kind of demonized for the views that you hold. And what I take issue most from this, going away from freedom of speech, is that if you dictate what people can say online, in public, you essentially, down the road, engineer what people think. It's
Mhm.
very dangerous, and
Here's
it's
my
never
biggest
really been
problem.
done.
My biggest problem is that people now are like, if you don't agree with one, if so, if me and there's me and someone across the table from me, if I have one different view than them, now apparently all my views are different from them, which is completely untrue, and you can't base an entire person off of one view that they have.
Exactly. People are
And
complicated.
that's,
Very
I think that's a
shallow.
huge issue, is because people aren't willing, even if you think whatever that one thing is completely wrong, that doesn't mean everything about them is wrong.
Mhm.
You know, you could agree on like 70 or 80% of things, but that one little idea. And I think that's where people aren't willing to give room and be like, okay, I still know who this person is as a human being. So,
Mhm.
oh no, they have this one view that's completely different than me. No longer can I have a discussion with you. No longer can I be friends with you or associate. And it's like,
Yeah. Well, it's a complete lack of understanding that there's nuance to every issue. These wouldn't be complex issues if there wasn't layers and layers of nuance. And people, inherently, yeah, like you said, Connor, like it's not as if we're subscribing to like a streaming service and you get all the benefits that come with it. You think a certain way, maybe you lean a certain way politically, but it doesn't mean you have all those enumerated views necessarily. Like I would disagree with. So again, there's a big uh, asterisk around this whole conversation, and that is that people are complicated and that you can't divide them into segments based on political beliefs or any other thing, really. I mean, you can try, but that's not going so well. But I just want to get back to what Phil said quickly about like engineering thought. And because that's not something we touched on yet, just how important being able to speak freely is to being able to think freely, and vice versa. If there are taboo subjects, if there are things that if you even talk about or think about or write about, then you will be excommunicated, essentially. I mean, where does that leave society in the long run?
Well, so
And will you even be able to think dissent?
engineered thought has, especially, we try to shy away from talking about COVID too much, but especially in COVID, there was a lot of engineered thought. If at any point you said something that was in contravention to what the WHO, to the World Health Organization said, you were
we gotta
immediately
cut
branded
this.
as spreading misinformation, right? Like, even if you presented peer-reviewed studies about therapeutics or about alternatives to using vaccines to combat COVID, you were immediately branded as spreading misinformation. Which, well, hold
Yeah,
on
we have to
for a
cut this part.
second.
We can't. No, we gotta
Why?
cut this
This is
part.
gonna. I
Why?
feel
We're
like
gonna
it's gonna
fucking
get.
cancel. We're gonna get shadow banned before we
yeah.
even go up.
Oh my god.
I don't think so.
That's the fucking problem right there.
I think even just
I
saying
think
COVID is gonna do it.
Let's keep it in
Yeah.
because this proves our very point. Fuck it.
And on what Cameron said, and we kind of been going back and forth. Cam and I have talked about these ideas a lot. So we're seeing now, we're kind of going into, well, you can't have freedom of speech because there's such thing as hate speech. Well, first of all, who defines hate speech? It's these people in legislative bodies that got elected and have a certain view, and also the social side of it. But what's very new,
University. It's the universities.
what's very new
Oh yeah, university is a breeding ground for it.
is that once upon a time, what you couldn't say and what was considered hate speech was defined clearly. Inciting
Still is
violence,
defined.
this and that. It's pretty fairly
It's
defined.
abusive or
Now,
threatening speech or writing that expresses
defined in
prejudice
law.
against a
It's
particular
defined in
it's
law.
defined in law. But
particular
what we're
group.
seeing from these social media companies is what you ought to say. So they're basically telling you what to think. And that's insane, actually.
Yeah.
Hate
Well,
speech
but
is
again-
different.
again-
Hate speech is a lot different from telling people what to say, though.
No,
It's
because
telling people what not to
if
say.
you
The point is
If-
who decides what is hate speech. So again, like we mentioned earlier, clearly there are things that you can say, blatantly prejudiced things that shouldn't be allowed because it's not part of civil discourse.
Well, so in terms of law telling you what you can't and can't say, unfortunately, that exists in Canada as of, I believe, 2018 it was. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of that legislation because the YouTube algorithm gods might get a little bit mad at me. But I encourage every Canadian and to be honest, everybody to research what I'm talking about. There is specific legislation surrounding a social issue that forces you to adhere to a certain line of speech. And it's a slippery slope to censoring and diminishing our freedom of expression.
Yeah. But bottom line, I mean, the hate speech debate is, again, at its root, just about who defines truth. And so, you know, there's arguments to be made there on both sides what defines hate speech, because, you know, some people will take it too far and say, you know, patriotism, love of the United States could be hate speech because of the dominant cultural narrative that the United States represents a white supremacist imperialist power. You know, and that's not a leap of logic there, because it happens. So it's a
Now,
fine
but
line to walk. It's a fine line to walk is the bottom line. And we're running out of time, so if there's any last thoughts, let's have them now. But
I was just gonna say, isn't America, like, being patriotic to America, isn't that like the pursuit of freedom and happiness? Isn't that the whole motto of America?
well, yes, but if you're of the opinion that the United States represents nothing more than a colonial imperialist power which has done nothing but subject its people since, you know, the 17th century, you know, and is an evil empire, to use the words of Ronald Reagan, against his own country, then I don't know. That's the point, right? Like, who defines anything? Everything is up to point of view, and points of view should be heard. All points of view. And if someone has a terrible point of view,
Then it should be known.
it should be known, and then do what you will, I suppose. But this
and having these
people,
opposing, sorry,
the mob,
ahead.
the ganging up, the canceling, the ostracization from a cult is what it takes the form of. That just needs to stop. We can have other ideas beat other ideas in a civil way. That's all we want, right? Civility,
Go ahead, Phil.
preservation of our democracy. Okay, Phil.
I was going to say that what the left stand for in a nutshell, and I'm definitely not going to generalize it.
So you got 1 minute, by the way.
I know they believe that you need to progress, whether it's like politically, whatever. What they're doing, it is my understanding that it's totally against what they think. Like they want to progress, but not having conversations is just, we're just gonna stay stagnant and nothing's gonna get done essentially.
Not having opposing views is stopping progression.
That's right. Compromise, sharing ideas, it's absolutely conducive to a functioning society.
Yeah, and once you
Guys,
destroy
we
this,
are at the end of this episode.
once you destroy the
so-
right, once you destroy the right, it's not coming back. You know.
It's not something you
All right,
can take
guys.
back.
Well, that's the end of the episode. So make sure to subscribe to our new YouTube. Still listen to us on Spotify. Hopefully our sound's a little better now. And remember to take care and brush your hair.